Hello everyone and welcome to part 5 of the Volvo project. If you haven't seen the previous parts, I've added some links to the description below. I think some of this material is actually older than part 3, but I've been working everywhere on this car at the same time, so it's hard to keep track. Anyway, I bought a new to me engine. It's a 25 or so year old B230 FK, originally from a Volvo 940. This means it's a 4-cylinder turbo engine of 2.3 liter. Even stock, it's much more powerful than the old engine, and it just looks cool. From just the size difference here, you can kinda tell how much fun I'm going to have trying to fit this in the car. This was one of the first test fits, and I quickly realized I hadn't cut out enough from the firewall. I still pushed it in as far as possible, as it helped me visualize just how much space I will need. The engine is way too far forward and is being blocked by this body reinforcement. The square hole behind that is for the original fan, which definitely won't fit anymore. The engine is barely behind the front beam and it was hell to get it here, so definitely doesn't work in the long run. From inside you can see the gearbox. The drive shaft coupler is sitting probably 20 centimeters in front of where the old gearbox sat. The engine is also sitting quite high due to interference between the front suspension and oil pan. I also started fitting another kind of rear axle at the same time, but we'll have to get back to that later. At the time I was pretty scared of removing too much at a time, but if you look at the state of this and with some hindsight, there's not a lot to save. I took a break for a few months and worked on other projects before getting back to this. Before the break I had already removed the plates where the cooler sits. I have an idea of replacing them with a stronger and removable solution in the future. Since it was a while ago I worked on it, I did another test fit of the motor and decided that the reinforcement really needs to go. And no longer scared of cutting the car apart, I removed quite a large part of the firewall in one go. I'm using the stud in the car to easily get both a center and depth mark for aligning the gearbox. I've placed some new bushings up where the engine mounts sit on the front beam. The thick plates on top is the base for the new engine mounts. To make something that fits on the engine, I cut off the heads on a few bolts and sharpened them to a point. This makes it really easy to transfer the exact locations to cardboard. This method generally gets you near perfect results on the first try, without having to measure a single thing. Now it's just a matter of connecting the two plates. I lowered the motor to where I thought I wanted it, and tacked some scrap rebar to both plates. I put on just enough weld to hold the rebar in place, yet still allow it to be removed at a later stage. The photo was taken as I was lifting the engine back out after this procedure. Here it's much easier to see how the mounts need to sit. This was my first attempt at freeforming some engine mounts, and oh boy did I do an awful job. Either way I cut up plate after plate, trying to connect and reinforce the whole construction. But the engine mounts are so far behind the mounts on the beam. This, and way too much shooting from the hip, made me create this absolute monster. At least the engine sits much better now, quite low and further back compared to my first tests. It is quite tight between the suspension arms, but it should be fine. I don't remember exactly why, only that it was related to the engine, but at this stage I started looking further into the rotten floor. I think it still interfered quite a bit with the gearbox, and the more I cut out to clear the gearbox, the more rust I would find. So I just went deeper and deeper basically. Obviously, this quickly gets out of hand on old cars. I mostly tried to use a wire brush and flap disc to find spot welds, which I could then drill out and try to separate the panels. Here you can clearly see some of my previous repairs from part 1. I might make this a bit prettier now that it's so easily accessible. This is a recurring theme by now, but the more you remove, the more rust you find. This is the frame beneath. Doesn't seem promising. I'm pretty sure steel is not supposed to have holes through it like that. Whilst the entire floor here wasn't bad, large parts of it was. So I kept scaling it back, because I'd rather replace one piece than do a patchwork of repairs. And suddenly I'm missing half a floor. The rear part looked better than the front from a distance, but up close it's in really bad condition with a lot of pinholes. Closer inspection of the frame underneath shows that the middle sections are somewhat okay, but all the intersection and where it connects to the body are completely rotten. Using an air chisel to see if I could make the spot welds show better, the rust and paint hide them quite well. Relatively quickly, I realized it wasn't worth the work and just cut it out instead. I won't be reusing this either way. Then I'm just trying to clean the edges up to make replacement panels easier to make. This area was a bit more sensitive, and I really wanted to be careful when removing the remaining reinforcement piece. Carefully grinding across where I thought the spot welds would be, and they show up quite well. Here I have mostly drilled out the spot welds. Then I go at it with the air chisel to separate the plates. Since the spot welds are barely holding on, it's almost always the drilled out side that shears off if you aim right. drilling off the spot welds I previously didn't see, and more chiseling. One reinforcement removed with most of the parent metal intact. Preferably you would drill even more shallow and leave little nubbins instead, but I'm a complete amateur. While I was in the area and had the chisel out, I cleaned out quite a lot of underbody stuff, so I could further inspect all of these seams for rust, since clearly I'm finding rust absolutely everywhere. If you hit it with the chisel at the right angle, this is incredibly efficient. If you hit it at the wrong angle, you mess the plate up. But I'm running quite low pressure on the chisel, so it doesn't do more damage than scratches in the steel. It still takes some time, but sure beats using solvents or doing all of this by hand like I previously did. A little bit later, and the area is definitely clean enough for proper inspection. And if you guessed that all the seams are rusty, you were right! Eventually I got back to continuing on the floors. Since I now knew most of the frame was garbage, I wasn't as careful and just went at it. There's more efficient ways of doing this, but believe it or not, this was pretty fun. It taught me a lot of how to handle both the airgun and how the steel reacts. Just a little inspection of a tiny area around the driver's feet. I believe this was the corner that hardly held on to the body. This jack point is rusted to a complete crisp. This entire seam was more rust than steel. This intersection barely has any structure left. And yes, the frame is rusted about a decimeter further up this way. I kept going for a while with an angle grinder and air chisel, finding every point of troublesome rust and just removing it so I can fix it later. So yeah, I started making engine mounts and now I don't have a floor. That's what my brain is like. This obviously took a fair few days. At least it gave me some time to reflect upon my engine placement. And now that I barely have a firewall at all, placing the engine is suddenly much easier. Now there's finally plenty of space for intercooler, regular cooler, fans and so on. The biggest problem is still the oil pan being too close to the front beam for a proper lowering of it. So what do? Cut your oil pan open apparently. I looked around and should still be plenty of space for the crank. So I bolted the pan to my work table, which has been planed somewhat flat. I was as thorough as possible cleaning everything up, in and outside, before hammering some plates to fit and TIG welding them in place. You can probably see I've done stuff up at the oil plug as well. That's because I saw this horrible so-called repair. I ground it all down and re-welded the actual problem. With that done, I could further lower the engine and finally feel some satisfaction with the placement. I used the gearbox output and crankshaft pulley to align and hold the engine centered. This way nothing can wander as I'm working around the engine. Oh, and look at that beautiful frame. What a lucky angle. I did my best to get it fairly flat as well. It leans slightly backwards as that helped a lot with reducing the gearbox invasion into the driving area. Alright, second attempt at engine mounts. I reclaimed the plates that go on the engine block. I also realized that I've already cut the entire car apart, I might as well move where the engine bushings sit as well. So I removed the original mounts and measured out a new place that would sit more in line with the mounts on the engine block. Suddenly, the engine mounts looked a lot simpler, whilst also being a lot stronger. Not the best photos I've taken, but at least you can tell they're gonna be sturdy as heck. With the motor finally in its hopefully final position, I whipped up a quick support that sits underneath the gearbox so the weight of the engine doesn't twist the front beam with the body in such a weak state. I can't make a new transmission mount to the frame with it barely holding itself together. I finally welded in some supports for the body to help it retain its shape. I should have done this part before I removed the floors, but I never imagined I would remove so much and kinda got carried away. There's obviously a lot of cutting left to do still, so might as well do it now. That'll be it for this time. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next adventure. Please leave a comment if you liked the video. I love hearing from my viewers, and if you hit that like button, it really helps me out a lot. Goodbye.